If you've been following the ongoing legal drama involving actor and director Justin Baldoni and actress Blake Lively, you might have noticed another lawsuit quietly unfolding in the background, one that suddenly brought Baldoni's lead attorney into the spotlight. While the media was quick to report when the lawsuit against attorney Brian Freedman first appeared, there has been far less discussion about what happened afterward. Recently, however, a judge in Los Angeles Superior Court issued an important ruling on a key motion in the case, and the decision reveals a lot about what claims will move forward and which ones have now been dismissed. The dispute centers on Freedman himself, who currently represents Justin Baldoni in his widely discussed legal conflict with Blake Lively. But before becoming Baldoni's attorney in that high-profile litigation, Freedman had represented a very different client, Travis Michael Flores, a writer born with cystic fibrosis who believed Baldoni's 2019 film 5 Feet Apart had copied ideas from his own screenplay titled 3 Feet Distance. Flores claimed his story and experiences had inspired the film, which also focused on the cystic fibrosis community. That copyright dispute was filed in federal court in 2021. Ultimately, the copyright case did not end with a dramatic court battle or a judgment in favor of either side. Instead, it concluded with what lawyers call a walk-away settlement. In practical terms, that means neither side admitted fault, no damages were paid, and both parties simply agreed to end the case. The lawsuit was formally dismissed in March 2022, bringing the dispute to a quiet close. But the story did not end there. Years later, the situation resurfaced under very different circumstances. Travis Flores sadly passed away in May 2024, and his estate, represented by his surviving spouse, Clement Surrey, later filed a new lawsuit against Brian Freedman. The claims were not about Baldoni's film itself. Instead, they focused on Freedman's conduct as Flores's former lawyer and statements he later made to the media. The issue began when journalists asked Freedman about the earlier copyright dispute after he became Baldoni's attorney in the widely publicized litigation involving Blake Lively. In response, Freedman made comments describing Baldoni and the other defendants in the earlier case as honorable people who had done nothing wrong, and he also noted that the previous lawsuit had ended without any liability being found against Baldoni or the other parties involved. From Freedman's perspective, those statements were simply factual commentary about a resolved case, but Flores's estate interpreted the remarks very differently. According to the lawsuit, those public statements allegedly implied that Flores's claims had lacked credibility and, by extension, harmed the reputation of the late writer. The estate argued that the comments drew renewed media attention to the old lawsuit and caused reputational damage, while also forcing the estate to deal with additional legal and media-related expenses. In response to the lawsuit, Freedman filed what is known as an anti-SLAPP motion. Anti-SLAPP laws, short for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, are designed to quickly dismiss lawsuits that target protected speech, particularly statements related to public issues or public interest. Freedman's argument was that the claims against him were largely based on comments he made to the media, and therefore those statements should be protected under the First Amendment and California's anti-SLAPP statute. The court then had to evaluate whether the lawsuit was truly targeting protected speech or whether it involved other types of legal claims that should proceed through the normal litigation process. After reviewing the arguments and evidence presented by both sides, the judge issued a mixed ruling, one that partially granted Freedman's motion while allowing several claims to move forward. Specifically, the judge dismissed the defamation and invasion of privacy claims entirely. The reasoning was straightforward. Under the law, these types of claims generally cannot be brought on behalf of someone who has already passed away. Because Travis Flores was deceased, his estate could not legally pursue those particular causes of action based on statements allegedly made about him. As a result, those claims were struck from the lawsuit. However, that was only part of the ruling. While the defamation and privacy claims were dismissed, 3 other allegations, breach of contract, legal malpractice, and breach of fiduciary duty, were allowed to continue. Importantly, the judge did not rule that those claims were valid or proven. Instead, the court concluded that the anti-SLAPP law was not the appropriate legal mechanism to eliminate them at this early stage of the case. In other words, those remaining claims can still be challenged later through other legal arguments or motions, but they cannot be dismissed solely on the basis that Freedman's statements were protected speech. For now, the court concluded that there was enough potential merit for those issues to remain part of the lawsuit, while the case continues to develop. Another key aspect of the judge's reasoning involved the nature of the allegations themselves. The court noted that many of the claims made by Flores's estate relate to actions that allegedly occurred while Flores was still Freedman's client, such as the legal advice given during the original copyright case and the recommendation to settle the lawsuit. Considering that those allegations concern the attorney-client relationship rather than public statements to the press, they fall outside the typical protections provided by anti-SLAPP laws. As the judge explained, malpractice claims based on how an attorney handled a client's case, things like investigating evidence, advising on settlements, or managing the client's legal strategy, are considered ordinary legal disputes. They are not automatically shielded by laws designed to protect free speech. For that reason, the court determined that those allegations should proceed through the standard legal process rather than being dismissed through an anti-SLAPP motion. By the time the ruling was issued, the situation had evolved into a complicated legal intersection involving three separate storylines: the original copyright disputes surrounding 5 Feet Apart, the current high-profile litigation between Baldoni and Blake Lively, and now the malpractice lawsuit brought by the estate of Travis Flores against his former attorney. And as the judge's decision made clear, the legal questions surrounding Freedman's conduct are far from resolved. While some claims have now been eliminated, others remain active, and the reasoning behind the judge's decision reveals deeper legal questions about attorney duties, public statements, and how far free speech protections extend when a lawyer discusses a former client's case. To understand why the judge allowed some claims to move forward while dismissing others, it's important to look more closely at how California's anti-SLAPP law actually works. The law follows a two-step analysis. First, the defendant must show that the claims against them are based on activity protected under the statute, usually speech related to a public issue or participation in public debate. If that first step is satisfied, the burden then shifts to the plaintiff, who must demonstrate that their claims still have at least minimal legal merit. In this case, the court determined that only certain parts of the lawsuit were based on protected speech. Specifically, the statements Brian Freedman made to the press about Justin Baldoni and the earlier copyright dispute clearly qualified as speech related to a matter of public interest. The litigation between Baldoni and Blake Lively had already attracted global attention, and the older dispute involving Travis Flores resurfaced as part of that public conversation. Because Freedman's comments were made to journalists about that controversy, the court acknowledged that they fell within the type of speech the anti-SLAPP law is designed to protect. But the judge also emphasized an important distinction. Not every allegation in the lawsuit was about those media statements. Many of the claims focused on Freedman's actions years earlier when he represented Travis Flores during the copyright case. According to the estate's complaint, Freedman allegedly failed to properly investigate the case, advised Flores to settle a potentially strong claim, and did not adequately handle certain responsibilities associated with the representation. These allegations formed the basis for the claims of legal malpractice, breach of contract, and breach of fiduciary duty. Because those allegations concern the quality of legal representation rather than public speech, the court concluded they fall outside the protections of anti-SLAPP law. The judge noted that malpractice claims related to how a lawyer handled a client's case are considered ordinary legal disputes. Anti-SLAPP statutes are not meant to shield attorneys from scrutiny over professional conduct that occurred during representation. For that reason, those allegations could not be dismissed through the anti-SLAPP motion. The ruling also addressed a few specific accusations made by the estate. One involved the claim that Freedman failed to maintain and return a complete client file after the representation ended. Another allegation suggested he did not disclose a potential conflict of interest when he later began representing Justin Baldoni. The court explained that both issues relate directly to obligations an attorney owes to a client, and therefore cannot be treated as protected speech. As a result, they remain part of the case moving forward.
However, when the court turned back to the statements Freedman made to the press, the analysis became more complex. The judge agreed that those statements were indeed protected speech at the first stage of the anti-SLAPP test, but the second step required examining whether the estate's claims had at least minimal merit despite that protection. In other words, even if the statements involved protected speech, the lawsuit could still continue if there was a reasonable argument that the comments violated Freedman's professional duties as an attorney. One of the key issues involved attorney confidentiality. Under California law, lawyers owe extremely strict duties to their clients, even after the attorney-client relationship ends. Confidential information does not only include private conversations or documents. It can extend to virtually any information learned during the course of representing a client, including facts that might already exist in public records if revealing them could harm the former client. The judge explained that the purpose of these rules is to protect the integrity of the attorney-client relationship. Clients must feel confident that information shared with their lawyer will not later be used against them or disclosed in a way that causes embarrassment or damage. Because of that, the legal definition of confidential information is far broader than what most people might assume. Freedman argued that his comments to the media did not reveal any confidential information because they referred only to Baldoni's character and what he had learned from Baldoni's side of the dispute. However, the court found that this argument did not fully resolve the issue. The judge noted that an attorney's duty of confidentiality can apply even to information obtained from other sources if it relates to the representation of a former client. If disclosing that information could harm the client or undermine their position, it may still fall within the scope of the attorney's professional obligations. Because of that interpretation, the court concluded that there was at least a triable issue of fact regarding whether Freedman's media statements violated those duties. In simple terms, that means the judge believed there was enough evidence or argument presented to justify allowing the issue to be examined further during litigation. The court was not deciding whether Freedman actually violated his obligations, only that the claim was plausible enough to continue. Another argument raised by Freedman involved what's known as the fair report privilege, which can protect statements that accurately summarize official legal proceedings. But the court found that the statements in question did more than simply summarize the earlier lawsuit. According to the ruling, Freedman's comments went further by expressing strong opinions about Baldoni's character and declaring that the defendants had done absolutely nothing wrong. Because those remarks went beyond a neutral description of the case, the judge determined that the privilege could not automatically apply at this stage. Freedman also attempted to rely on litigation privilege, another legal doctrine that sometimes protects statements made in connection with legal proceedings. However, the court concluded that this privilege typically applies to statements made within the litigation process itself, such as in court filings or hearings, not to comments made during press interviews or media releases. Since Freedman's remarks were directed to journalists rather than the court, the judge ruled that litigation privilege did not shield them in this context. Taken together, these findings meant that the estate had successfully demonstrated minimal merit for its malpractice-related claims connected to the media statements. That was enough to allow those allegations to remain in the case, even though the court had already dismissed the defamation and invasion of privacy claims. The judge also pointed out another critical legal principle. Attorneys do not have exactly the same freedom of expression as ordinary citizens when discussing matters related to their clients. While lawyers still have First Amendment rights, those rights are limited by the professional duties they owe to current and former clients. In other words, the ethical obligations of the legal profession can place restrictions on what attorneys are allowed to say publicly. That distinction became a central theme in the ruling. The court acknowledged that Freedman's comments were part of a public conversation about a widely discussed legal battle involving celebrities, but it also emphasized that an attorney's professional responsibilities can override ordinary free speech protections when those statements involve information connected to a former client. By the end of the analysis, the judge had effectively divided the lawsuit into two separate categories: claims that could not legally proceed at all and claims that deserved further examination in court, and that distinction would ultimately determine the future direction of the case.
After working through the legal standards and the details of the anti-SLAPP motion, the judge ultimately reached a clear conclusion about how the case should move forward. Two of the estate's claims, defamation and invasion of privacy, were dismissed entirely. The reasoning behind this decision was rooted in a basic legal principle. Under the law, those types of claims generally cannot be brought on behalf of someone who has already passed away. Because Travis Michael Flores died in May 2024, his estate cannot pursue defamation or privacy claims based on statements allegedly made about him after his death.
The court also noted that although Clemens Surrey, Flores's surviving spouse, filed the lawsuit in his own name as the administrator of the estate, the complaint did not allege that the statements made by attorney Brian Freedman personally defamed Surrey or violated his privacy. Without that direct connection, the court found there was no legal basis for those claims to continue. As a result, both the defamation and privacy causes of action were struck from the lawsuit under California's anti-SLAPP statute. However, the case did not end there. 3 other claims, legal malpractice, breach of contract, and breach of fiduciary duty, remain active. The judge emphasized that this decision does not mean the court believes those claims are true or that Freedman will ultimately be found liable. Instead, the ruling simply means the anti-SLAPP law is not the correct legal tool to dismiss them at this early stage. Those issues will now proceed through the normal litigation process, where both sides will have the opportunity to present evidence and arguments. One particularly interesting observation in the ruling involved how Freedman's later actions might still become relevant evidence in the case. The judge pointed out that even though Freedman's media statements were protected speech for anti-SLAPP purposes, they could still potentially be introduced in court as evidence connected to the malpractice claims. For example, if the estate argued that Freedman advised Flores to settle the original copyright case because he hoped to establish a future relationship with Justin Baldoni, those later statements praising Baldoni could theoretically be used to support that theory. The judge did not say that this actually happened, and there is no finding that such a motive existed. The court simply explained that the law would allow such evidence to be considered if it were relevant to proving malpractice during the earlier representation. In other words, the statements themselves may be protected speech, but they could still play a role in understanding the broader context of the attorney-client relationship. Another practical consequence of the ruling involves legal fees. Because Freedman succeeded in having 2 of the claims dismissed, he may request reimbursement for some of the attorney's fees and costs associated with that portion of the motion. However, the judge clarified that any fee award would have to be limited only to the part of the motion that was successful, specifically the arguments related to defamation and invasion of privacy. Fees connected to the claims that survived the motion would not be recoverable at this stage. Beyond the technical legal outcome, the case also highlights the unusual chain of events that led to the dispute. The original conflict began with a screenplay written by Travis Flores titled 3 Feet Distance, inspired by his experiences living with cystic fibrosis. Flores later believed that the film 5 Feet Apart, directed by Justin Baldoni and released in 2019, was derived from similar ideas. That disagreement led to the 2021 copyright lawsuit, which Freedman handled as Flores's attorney before the case eventually ended in a walkaway settlement. Years later, after Flores's passing, Freedman found himself representing Baldoni in a completely different legal battle, this time involving actress Blake Lively. That high-profile litigation drew intense public attention, and reporters revisited the earlier dispute involving Flores. Freedman's comments to the press during that media coverage ultimately became the foundation for the lawsuit filed by the Flores estate. Now, with the judge's ruling on the anti-SLAPP motion, the legal landscape is much clearer. The case has been narrowed significantly, eliminating the claims that were legally impossible to pursue while leaving the core allegations about attorney conduct intact. From here, the remaining claims will move into the next phases of litigation, where the parties may engage in discovery, file additional motions, or potentially reach a resolution before the case ever reaches trial. For observers following the broader legal saga surrounding Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively, this ruling is another reminder of how complex high-profile legal disputes can become. What began as a disagreement over a screenplay evolved into a copyright lawsuit, then resurfaced years later in the middle of a completely separate celebrity legal battle. And now, with the malpractice claims still alive, the courts may eventually examine whether the actions taken during that earlier case met the professional standards required of an attorney. In the end, the judge's decision doesn't determine who was right or wrong. Instead, it simply sets the stage for the next chapter of the case, one that will focus less on public statements and more on the underlying question of whether the legal representation provided to Travis Flores met the obligations required by law.